tossing, turning, staying up all night long. Just want you by my side.
Chapter 16. Harry was hiding. Huddled beneath his father's invisibility cloak, he crouched down by the front door, remaining half hidden behind a conveniently placed potted plant for extra security. He eyed the plant suspiciously. It was a very convenient plant, to be honest, and now he couldn't stop thinking about it. In fact, he was almost positive that the plant had not existed until he'd been looking for something to hide behind in case Moody or Dumbledore came by with their all-seeing eyes and spotted him. Where, exactly, did this delightfully suspicious fern come from? A fleeting touch to his shoulder from an invisible entity answered that particular question, and Harry stopped feeling paranoid about randomly appearing plants. If death could materialize a book and glasses, why not plants? Despite the fact that he was silenced, disillusioned, underneath an invisibility cloak and squatting behind a plant, Harry still held his breath when Mrs. Weasley went trotting by, her face worried as she obviously searched for him. He felt a bit bad for worrying her, but honestly he was about to go mad. The Order had been hounding him constantly ever since he'd dropped the Voldemort's dead deal with it bombshell the other day, obviously unimpressed with his descriptive skills or Death's demonstration, which he had thankfully not been present to witness. The second-hand accounts had been creepy enough. He had no desire to see any half-digested bits of Voldemort. Thank you very much. The hand on his shoulder squeezed briefly as if in response to the direction his thoughts had taken. Harry was unable to be surprised by this point. Death could do just about everything else. Reading minds couldn't be that far of a stretch for him. Harry contemplated his own reaction to this new development, wondering why he wasn't as bothered by the idea of Death reading his mind as he would be if, say, Dumbledore were doing it instead. They were both invasions of his privacy, something he guarded religiously, and he was equally powerless to stop either of them. But he trusted Death. He wouldn't trust Dumbledore not to pass him cyanide if he asked for salt. Death, though. Death had protected him, been honest with him, and seemed to genuinely care for his mental and emotional well-being, which was more than what most of the adults in his life could claim. Also, Death was massively powerful and perfectly willing to use and abuse this power for Harry's benefit, which he shamelessly took advantage of whenever it suited his purposes. Case in point, Voldemort. Harry peered around his plant and watched for any other Order members that might come across them at an unfortunate time, such as when he was preparing to open the door and get the hell out of Grimmauld Place before he went mad and started eating people's livers with a side of fava beans. He could almost feel Death's amusement at that particular possibility, and Harry cracked a grin in reply. He couldn't help but notice that he was rather steadily adapting to Death's odd sense of humor, and even using some of it himself. Whether this was a result of something Death had done to him or simply a side effect of actually having a close, almost family member for the first time that he was spending an actual length of time with was uncertain, but Harry wasn't too terribly bothered by it. Death seemed to be getting on just fine, odd humor and all, and Harry would be happy if he could grow to be a tenth of the man Death was. Just, without the being dead and immortal part. He could do without those. Deciding the coast was as clear as it was going to get, Harry quietly and carefully lifted one hand for the doorknob, making sure to remain concealed under his cloak. He knew he could have simply gotten Death to take him from the house, but it didn't feel right using the entity like a transportation service. And he sort of missed the thrill of sneaking around. The door opened with a god-awful squeal of rusty hinges, and Harry bolted through it, not taking any chances of the sound attracting attention, cursing himself for not thinking to silence the bloody door before he opened it. He was getting awfully rusty at this. Mentally smacking his head against a wall at the horrible puns his internal monologue was coming up with, Harry made for the corner like he had Fluffy on his heels. By this point his cloak was pretty useless, having flown up around him as he ran like any other cloak would have, turning him into a pair of sprinting, disembodied legs for anyone who cared to look outside at that particular moment. He rounded the corner and pressed his back against the nearest house, catching his breath and letting the cloak settle back around him again. He could almost imagine hearing the raised voices from panicking Order members, but of course no sound actually escaped the wards. Smiling with success, Harry began striding off around the corner, hoping to find a rather hidden spot to summon the night bus. He planned to visit Diagon Alley. The Order never would have let him go, not even under heavy guard and pop by Gringotts while he was at it. He'd had plenty of time to think while the Order tried to tear down his locking charms, and he'd become convinced that Dumbledore's repeated insistence that he return to his relatives was beyond illegal. Surely his parents had left a will behind or something. And what right did a headmaster of a school have to go around placing orphans with muggles, anyway? Not that he was all that worried about the Dursleys anymore. He had death with him now, and a part of Harry sort of wanted to go back to Privet Drive just so he could watch his fat walrus of an uncle try something and have death react. He shoved that part of him farther back, trying to ignore it. Those urges had always been there when it came to the Dursleys, but Harry wasn't quite at the point where he could, in good conscience, go to their house with the express purpose of having them brutally murdered. Because that was what would obviously happen should he return there. Either Death would take umbrage to the fact that his relatives treated him like a house elf and would do something unnatural to them, or Harry would finally snap and blow the house up with accidental magic. Harry wasn't particularly proud of these thoughts, but that didn't mean he felt guilty about them. These people had enslaved him since he was barely old enough to walk, and he had absolutely zero compassion for them and their eventual fate. He could feel Death's hand still gripping his shoulder. It had magically not left even during his spastic sprint, which was both creepy and impressive as it tightened briefly. Harry knew he had no control over Death's actions. He also knew Death knew exactly how the Dursleys treated him. In fact, if his guess was accurate, Death had lived through the same thing, only without the presence of a Death of his own to protect him, and that the Dursleys were living on borrowed time. Harry was certain that the moment he gave even the slightest indication that he wanted the Dursleys harmed, Death would slaughter them in a myriad of creatively macabre ways. The only question at this point was whether he'd be present to witness it or not. "We've arrived, Michelle." Harry jerked and looked up, surprised to find himself standing behind the leaky cauldron and in front of the entrance to the alley. He eyed the invisible space beside him suspiciously, wondering if Death had simply transported them here while he was lost in thought, or if he'd just legitimately traveled via night bus and through a busy pub without registering any of it. Death's hand never left his shoulder even as his other bled into visibility just long enough for the Elder Wand to tap out the opening pattern on the wall. The wand dissolved once the wall opened, and Death returned to the utter invisibility that put Harry's own cloak to shame. Sucking in a fortifying breath, Harry strode out into the alley, careful to weave around the people walking up and down the storefronts as he kept his cloak wrapped tightly around him. He had no intention of drawing attention to himself. His face and scar were practically the wizarding equivalent of neon strobe lights, but knocking into someone while invisible would do the same thing just as quickly. Harry paused at the steps of Gringotts, knowing that he really shouldn't walk into a bank covered in an invisibility cloak. He was sure they had wards to detect that kind of thing, and didn't want to be mistaken for a thief. He was equally reluctant to take off the cloak though, knowing he'd attract all sorts of attention the moment he did so. If Death were visible, he'd easily hold all the attention which Harry preferred, but he'd also cause a mass panic the moment someone saw his teeth or his hair or even felt his magic. "Don't fret, Michelle," a completely unfamiliar voice said in a very familiar tone, the hand on his shoulder suddenly solid in a way it had never been. Harry whirled around, utterly surprised, and the cloak was neatly pulled off with the motion as the tall, black-haired man standing beside him plucked it off via the hand on his shoulder. "I do know the meaning of discretion." The grin was all teeth, and unnervingly familiar on such a human face. There were no fangs or shadows or absinthe eyes, but the bloodthirsty, rather mad expression was something he'd only ever seen on the face of one person in his life. Harry gaped dumbly at the human form of who could only be Death, earning an amused smirk in reply. He greatly resembled the picture Harry had seen once of James Potter, only taller and with Lily's eyes. In fact, Harry would go so far as to say Death currently looked like a 30-year-old Harry Potter without the scar. It was blatantly obvious they were the same person, and Harry could only stare as his mind whirled chaotically. Was this what Death would look like if he were more than simply flesh and bones? Is this what Harry would look like when he was older? "We look identical," Harry finally choked out, getting unnerved by the mirror image effect going on in front of him. Death cocked a brow in response, the gesture eerily familiar. The features of human Death and immortal Death weren't terribly different. This Death had actual flesh and muscles and was still unfairly tall, and his skin was tanned rather than the sickly sort of gray it had been before, but Harry could see bits and pieces of death in this human before him. People will notice, he finished lamely, wondering why no one had started pointing and whispering at them yet. Death frowned, looking himself over briefly. "We are identical, my shell," came the rather bemused reply. "Did you expect me to look like someone else?" Harry supposed not. It was easy to forget that Death was actually Harry Potter, only from another dimension and from uncountable millennia into the future. But he rather thought Death was missing the point. "You can't look like me. I'm me. People will notice if my older clone is walking around Diagon Alley." Death stared at him rather blankly, as if the concept of people noticing an older version of the boy who lived was utterly incomprehensible. Then, as Harry watched, Death's hair bled white from root to tip like paint dripping in reverse, and his eyes turned a pale shade of blue that was almost translucent. His facial features didn't change, but with his new hair and eyes Death no longer looked like a clone of Harry. Harry sighed in relief. Honestly, sometimes reasoning with the entity was like pulling teeth from a Cerberus. "Thank you," Harry muttered, accepting the cloak when the grinning being offered it to him. As Harry headed for the bank, pointedly not looking at the guards in case they'd been watching and saw the whole thing, he glanced over at the nonchalant form of Death strolling along beside him, hands in his pockets. "You sound normal now," Harry observed. The voice was actually what bothered him the most about this transformation. Harry much preferred his deep, rasping voice to this new tenor one. Death made a face, as if he'd just tasted something unpleasant. "I know," he protested, sounding more like a whining child than an ageless immortal being of ultimate power. "Talking like this makes my throat ache." It's surprising the amount of effort it takes to craft a fully functional set of mortal vocal cords without them rotting immediately. Harry smirked at the sulking entity slumping along beside him, glancing up only to stop mid-stride. Every goblin in the bank was staring at them, silent as the grave and completely motionless. Each teller and guard had wide eyes locked on the two of them. Harry started feeling distinctly uncomfortable. The goblins rather resembled small animals that had just caught the scent of a massive predator, and had gone utterly still in an effort to avoid drawing attention to themselves. He glanced at Death out of the corner of his eye. The entity was grinning again, eyeing the goblins like one would eye a particularly delicious piece of chocolate, and Harry decided he should probably do something to prevent whatever it was Death was contemplating. Straightening his shoulders, Harry took a breath and headed for the nearest teller, Death strolling along at his heels. He couldn't help but notice the goblin he was approaching growing tenser and tenser as they neared, spindly fingers twitching as if reaching for a weapon before jerking and resting flat on the counter. Harry stopped in front of the counter, feeling more than seeing Death looming over his shoulder, human face doing nothing to hide the malevolent glee lurking behind the facade, and looked down at the gold nameplate resting innocuously in front of him. "Redax," Harry spoke, making the goblin and the four others closest to them recoil slightly. Harry paused briefly, frowning at the twitchy goblin teller, and it abruptly stilled into motionlessness again. "Redax," he repeated, continuing and ignoring the way the goblins had subtly closed the bank doors and were now guarding them with polearms and large battle axes. "I'd like to talk to someone about the Potter accounts." There. That was polite and to the point, Harry thought. The goblin, Redax, didn't so much as breathe. Growing irritated now, Harry grasped for his patience with both metaphorical hands. He had sort of half expected something like this to happen after he'd seen how Remus and the owl reacted to Death, but the entity wasn't even wearing his creepy form at the moment. He looked perfectly human, and wasn't even doing anything remotely threatening. Harry couldn't quite understand where this irrational fear was coming from. He'd never felt any sort of utter terror from Death, even before they'd become better acquainted. "Oh, honestly," Harry grumbled, turning on his heel and pressing his palm flat against the looming Death's chest, pushing firmly. "Back up. Maybe if you're not so damn close to him he'll remember how to function properly." Death leered at him, grinning wide, and obligingly took a few steps back. The goblins had all gone rigid the moment he'd touched Death, flinched backwards when he ordered Death to back up, and their jaws actually dropped when Death obeyed. Suddenly, every goblin in the room was looking at Harry as if he were Merlin reincarnate. Redax apparently regrew his spine and addressed Harry with the sort of deference one would expect to be reserved for the Queen, or perhaps the Emperor of Earth. "My most sincere apologies, Mr. Potter," said the goblin, all but oozing charm. Harry stared at the goblin as if it had just burst into song. Allow me to show you to Livercrusher's office. He is currently acting as the Potter account manager since the Chief Mugwomp's guardianship was lifted. Harry watched as the goblin, who had apparently had a personality transplant at some point in the past 2 minutes, stood and politely bowed, gesturing for Harry to follow him as he headed towards a side hallway. Death slid up beside him, his human form flickering along the edges like a poorly done illusion, and patted him on the shoulder with a look of mock commiseration on his features. There, Death cooed, voice momentarily lowering into the deep, hoarse register it normally occupied as his eyes flickered absinthe green. Clearing his throat with a Cheshire cat sort of smile, Death all but beamed at the exasperated wizard. I'm sure they aren't planning on treating you differently from any other wizard. The entity nodded gravely, betrayed by the wide grin plastered on his face. Harry stared at the face of the grinning immortal, and kicked him in the shin. That's the end of this chapter. Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe for more and to help this channel grow. See you next time.
You got some